It happened on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, the kind of day that blends into the background of a normal American life. Unremarkable, peaceful, routine. But within minutes, everything changed. A man, hidden behind a hoodie and a cold stare, spotted his target outside a grocery store in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Ohio. She was just an elderly woman, perhaps in her late 70s, slowly pushing a shopping cart to her car. Frail, alone, and unaware. To him, she looked like the perfect victim. But what happened next, what she did just seconds after he snatched her wallet, turned what should have been a quick, petty crime into a situation that would flip everything on its head. And trust me, the move she made next? It didn't just catch him off guard. It changed his life forever. Now, before we go any further, let me ask you something. Have you ever felt that gut-punching sense of injustice? That moment when you see someone prey on the weak, thinking they'll get away with it just because no one's watching? Because that's exactly where this story begins, and I promise you, by the end of it, you're going to see how one small action, just one phone call, had a ripple effect far greater than anyone could have expected. You clicked on this video for a reason, and I want you to hold on to that feeling, that curiosity, because every second from here on out will bring you closer to the answer you're looking for. And it's not what you think. I'm talking directly to you now, not just as a narrator, but as someone who knows how stories like these hit home. Maybe it reminds you of your own grandmother. Maybe you've seen someone get taken advantage of and felt powerless. Or maybe you're just tired of bad people getting away with everything while good people stay silent. If that sounds like you, then I need you to stay with me. Because this isn't just a story about a stolen wallet. It's about justice, consequences, and a hidden strength that no one saw coming, not even the guy who thought he could walk away scot-free. Now here's what makes this story different from the hundreds of petty crime videos you might see online. This woman, let's call her Eleanor, wasn't just any grandmother. Sure, she had that warm, kind energy you'd expect. Silver hair in a bun, a floral-patterned blouse, and a cart full of groceries, mostly canned soup and cat food. But what the thief didn't know, and what you're about to find out, is that Eleanor had lived a life far more complicated and courageous than most. And she wasn't the type to back down when something was taken from her, not anymore. The man who grabbed her wallet? His name's Marcus. He'd done this before, dozens of times. He knew exactly how to blend into the shadows, how to avoid security cameras, how to pick the right moment when the victim was distracted. He was smooth, fast, and detached. To him, it wasn't personal. It was just another score, another $50, and maybe a credit card or two. But as his fingers slipped into her purse and pulled out her wallet, he didn't realize Eleanor had already noticed him. Noticed his shoes, the tattoo on his wrist, even the way he tried to mask his face. She wasn't scared. She was calculating. And then, as he turned to run, wallet in hand, Eleanor did something unexpected. She reached for her phone, not to call 911, not to scream for help, but to make one very specific call that set off a chain reaction that no one saw coming. Not even Marcus. Let me be clear, this is not one of those feel-good stories where the cops show up 2 minutes later and arrest the guy. End of story.
No.
What happened next was messy, emotional, and complicated. It involved secrets from the past, a network of unlikely people, and a twist that had even the local police scratching their heads. But I want you to stick with me because by the end of this video, you're going to find out exactly who Eleanor called, what she said, and why that phone call didn't just bring a thief to justice, but changed 2 lives in ways that no one expected. You see, there's a reason this story is blowing up across YouTube right now. It's not just because it's about crime and drama. It's because it's about something much deeper, about power, resilience, and the idea that sometimes the people you underestimate the most are the ones who carry the heaviest stories. And once you hear what Eleanor had been through before this day, before this moment, you're going to realize why she didn't freeze in fear, why she didn't scream or beg, why she stayed calm and made that call. But before we get to that, let me take you back just a few hours before the theft happened. Back to Eleanor's quiet little kitchen, where she was sipping her morning tea and flipping through a photo album that had been buried in her closet for years. A photo album filled with faces from another time, some she missed, some she didn't. And tucked inside one of those pages was a worn-out business card. Faded. yellowed from time, but still readable. That business card would play a role in what was about to unfold, and it was the very first clue that Eleanor was a lot more prepared than anyone could have guessed. As the phone rang after the wallet was taken, ring, 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 someone picked up on the other end. And what Eleanor said in that moment didn't just set the story in motion. It turned everything upside down. So now, I have to ask, are you ready to find out who answered that call? Because the moment they did, this went from a simple theft to something much, much bigger. But first, let's go back to the moment it all went down second by second. Because buried in those seconds is the truth you came here to find. Ready? Let's begin. Let's rewind the clock just a little more. Because while it may seem like this story begins with a simple theft in a grocery store parking lot, the truth is, it started days earlier, maybe even years. Eleanor was not the kind of woman you notice right away. She didn't demand attention. She didn't speak loudly or carry herself with the sort of urgency people often mistake for importance. She moved through life quietly, gently, like someone who'd spent a long time learning how to stay invisible. But behind those soft gray eyes and slow, deliberate steps was a woman who had seen more in one lifetime than most people could handle in two. The past few weeks had been particularly strange for her. Her cat, Lucy, had stopped eating. Her neighbor across the hall had passed away suddenly. And, to make matters worse, someone had started calling her landline in the middle of the night, never saying anything. Just silence. Breathing. Then a hang-up. She didn't mention the calls to anyone. Not even her daughter, who lived 3 hours away in Columbus and called once a week out of routine. Never urgency. It wasn't that Eleanor didn't trust her daughter. She just didn't want to worry her. That was Eleanor's way. Carry the weight alone. Protect others from it. So when she left her house that afternoon to pick up groceries, there was a lot more going on under the surface than anyone could see. In fact, she almost didn't go at all. Something in her gut told her to stay home. But she'd ignored gut feelings before, and life had taught her that paranoia could be just as dangerous as recklessness. At the grocery store, Eleanor moved carefully through the aisles, her list memorized, her cart mostly empty. She didn't linger. She didn't chat with the cashier like she usually did. And as she walked through the automatic doors into the sunlit parking lot, she noticed the man across the street leaning against a newspaper vending machine. It was just for a second, a flash of recognition she couldn't quite place, but something about the way he was watching her made the hair on her neck stand up. She looked away quickly, told herself it was nothing, and kept moving toward her car. Now here's where things get murky. Because when you look at the security footage from the grocery store, yes, there is footage, you can see Marcus enter the frame 2 minutes after Eleanor. He never speaks. He never gets too close. But he keeps her in his line of sight, trailing just far enough behind to not seem suspicious. But who is Marcus, really? That's where things start to get strange. Because the local police, when reviewing the footage later, didn't find any matching records for someone by that name in the system. No priors. No recent arrests. No fixed address. And yet, when a retired detective, someone connected to Eleanor's past, got wind of the situation, he said Marcus wasn't new. He was familiar. Very familiar. So now you have Eleanor, a quiet woman with an old photo album and a suspicious business card hidden inside, being watched and followed by a man whose identity can't be confirmed. Add to that the mysterious phone calls, and something starts to take shape, but it's hard to say what. Could Marcus have been hired? Was this theft truly random, or was he looking for something specific, something hidden inside that wallet? The wallet, by the way, wasn't ordinary. It was old, leather, worn down at the seams. But inside were more than just a few credit cards and cash. Tucked behind a family photo was a small, laminated note. No one knew what it said. The note was gone by the time Marcus tossed the wallet a few blocks away, having already taken what he thought was valuable. But if you ask me, the note was the real prize and the real reason Eleanor made that call. And here's where it starts to get even more twisted. That business card Eleanor had saved for years? It belonged to someone from a part of her life she never talked about, not even to family. His name was Daniel Mercer, a former private investigator with a reputation for solving cases no one else would touch. He'd gone off the radar a decade ago after a scandal involving the disappearance of a local city official. No one ever proved anything, but rumors swirled. Whispers that Daniel had dirt on powerful people, that he'd made enemies, that he walked away to avoid ending up like some of his sources, vanished without a trace. But for some reason, Eleanor kept his card. For some reason, she trusted him. And when she saw Marcus running off with her wallet, her instincts didn't tell her to call the cops. They told her to call someone who knew how to disappear and find those who had. Daniel didn't pick up right away. In fact, Eleanor had to try 3 different numbers. Old ones from years ago, likely changed, disconnected, useless. But when one finally rang through, and he answered in a groggy voice from what sounded like a motel room, the first thing he said was, "Is it about the list?" Eleanor froze. The list. That was a word she hadn't heard in almost 20 years. And the way he said it, calm, tired, certain, told her everything she needed to know. He knew what this was. He knew it wasn't random. That's when you start to realize something bigger is happening here. The theft wasn't just a crime of opportunity. Eleanor wasn't just an old lady with bad luck. And Marcus? He may have been a low-level thug, but someone likely sent him. Someone who wanted something Eleanor had been keeping all these years. Maybe a document, maybe a piece of information, maybe something that looked worthless unless you knew what it meant. But now that it was gone, and now that Daniel was back in the picture, everything was moving again. Secrets were coming to the surface. But even with all this, we're still left with questions. Why now? Why would someone wait decades to come after her? Was Marcus working alone? Or was there someone else watching from a distance that day? A second car in the parking lot, perhaps. One that left moments after the theft but didn't make it onto the main security tape. Could someone have been following Marcus? Or was he being used as bait to flush Eleanor out? And here's another strange detail. When Eleanor's daughter came to visit the day after the incident, she noticed something odd about her mother's bookshelf. A particular book, always kept in the same spot, was gone. Not borrowed. Not misplaced. Gone. Eleanor claimed she never noticed it missing, but her daughter swears it was there the last time she visited. The book was hollowed out, she remembered, like one of those spy movies used to hide something valuable. Was that where the note came from? Was that what Marcus, or whoever sent him, was really after? All these little pieces start to blur the lines between coincidence and intent. And as Eleanor and Daniel begin retracing the events that led up to the theft, it becomes clear that nothing about that day was accidental. Not the timing, not the location, not even the man who took the wallet. Because as the story unravels, more players start to emerge, people from Eleanor's past she thought were long gone. A woman from her church who suddenly stopped coming to service. A man who used to mow her lawn and disappeared months ago after asking too many questions about her late husband. Are they involved? Or just more shadows in an already dark story? One thing certain, whoever pulled the strings on this theft knew exactly what they were doing. But they made one mistake. They underestimated Eleanor. And they had no idea who she would call when things went wrong. And just when you think you've got a grip on where this is all going, just when the puzzle seems to be coming together, something else happens. Something that throws everything into question. Because 3 days after the theft, a man matching Marcus's description turns up at a clinic in another state.
He's bruised, disoriented.
And when they ask his name, he gives one that no one expects. But we'll get to that soon. Because what happens next will challenge everything you think you know about the story. And believe me, it only gets deeper from here. 3 days after the theft, the story took a turn no one expected. Eleanor had spent the last 48 hours piecing things together with Daniel over late-night phone calls, scribbling notes in the margins of old calendars and recipe books because she didn't trust her thoughts to stay safe in a notebook. She was tired, overwhelmed, but not broken. If anything, something inside her had clicked back into place. A version of herself she thought she'd buried long ago was starting to resurface. She hadn't spoken to Daniel in over 15 years, not since the incident they both agreed never to talk about again. But now, with her wallet gone, strange voices on the phone, and Marcus's face still haunting her memory, it was clear the past wasn't finished with her yet. Daniel agreed to meet her the following morning at a diner on the edge of town, the kind that's always half empty and smells like burnt coffee and old vinyl booths. But the night before the meeting, something happened that changed everything. Eleanor had gone to retrieve the small box she'd hidden behind the water heater in her basement, something she hadn't touched since the day she moved in. It was just an old shoebox wrapped in duct tape, filled with clippings, documents, a flash drive, and a single Polaroid photo that had once meant everything. She remembered placing it there years ago, just in case. But when she got down to the crawl space and reached behind the heater, her hand landed on nothing but dust and cobwebs. The box was gone. No sign of forced entry, no disturbed shelves, nothing missing from the house. Just that one box vanished. Panic crept in, not in waves, but all at once. Because she knew someone had been inside. Not just inside her house, but inside her history. Someone who knew exactly what they were looking for. She didn't call the police. She didn't even tell Daniel. Something about the break-in felt like a warning, not a robbery. As if the person who took the box didn't want its contents, just wanted her to know they could take them whenever they pleased. She spent the rest of the night sitting in the dark, replaying every conversation from the last week, every face she'd passed at the store, every glance that lingered too long. That morning, when she finally met Daniel at the diner, he looked different. Older, worn down, but not in the way you'd expect from time. He looked like a man who hadn't stopped running since the last time they spoke. And when she told him about the box, his jaw tightened. He didn't say much, but his eyes said everything. He knew what was inside. And if someone else had it now, then they were both in real danger. Daniel mentioned someone else, an old contact from his days in private security, a man named Leon who now worked in cybersecurity under an assumed identity. Eleanor didn't recognize the name at first, but when Daniel showed her a photo, she felt her stomach drop. It was the same man who had once visited her husband late at night, just months before his accidental death. She'd always suspected there was more to that story, but her husband had been tight-lipped about his past, swearing that what he did before their marriage wasn't relevant. Now, staring at Leon's face, Eleanor wasn't so sure. Daniel suggested they reach out to him, said he could track the stolen flash drive if it had been plugged in anywhere. But when they tried, Leon didn't answer. Instead, they received an anonymous email just minutes later. It read, "Stop digging or you'll lose more than memories." That's when Daniel revealed something Eleanor hadn't known. That flash drive contained more than personal files. It had been part of an encrypted network Daniel had helped build in the early 2000s, back when he was still working in gray areas between law enforcement and private intel. The drive wasn't just storage, it was a key. One that could unlock years of archived data on powerful individuals, including politicians, corporate executives, even retired law enforcement. Names that weren't meant to resurface. Files that had been buried for a reason. And now someone knew Eleanor had it, or at least that she'd been close to someone who did. The deeper they dug, the more blurred the lines became. A woman named Carol, who'd been Eleanor's closest friend and Sunday church companion for over a decade, suddenly started acting distant, skipping service, ignoring phone calls. Eleanor brushed it off at first, thinking it might be health-related. But Daniel wasn't convinced. He found out that Carol's son worked in private security and had ties to a now-defunct surveillance firm that was under investigation years ago for unethical data collection. When he confronted Eleanor with the information, she refused to believe it. Carol was like family. But even family can be bought. Or worse, betrayed. To complicate things further, Daniel's motel room was broken into the following night. Nothing taken. Nothing touched. Just the lock scratched and the curtains left slightly ajar. It felt like the same message Eleanor had received. We're watching. We're close. And we'll act if you don't stop. And then came the twist that flipped the story on its head. Daniel, digging deeper into Marcus's background, finally got a hit, not from a law enforcement database, but from a private database of known aliases used by underground contractors. And the name Marcus had used at the clinic 3 days after the theft? It matched the alias of someone Daniel had once worked alongside, a former informant known for flipping on his employers at the last second to save himself. If it really was him, then Marcus hadn't been running from Eleanor or the police. He'd been running from whoever sent him in the first place. And that meant only one thing. Marcus didn't steal the wallet for himself. He stole it for someone else, and now he was terrified of what they might do to him for botching the job. Eleanor, caught between the collapse of her past and the chaos of her present, was running out of safe places to turn. The photo in the stolen box had been her final connection to her husband's secrets. The note inside the wallet long gone. Carol's silence felt more threatening by the day. And now, even Daniel, the one man she thought she could trust, was starting to act differently. There were moments when he'd trail off mid-sentence, eyes darting towards shadows in the corners of the room. Times when he'd say something cryptic, then walk it back. And once, when she caught him reading through one of her old letters, he claimed it was by accident, but Eleanor wasn't so sure. And just when things seemed like they couldn't get any more tangled, a package arrived on Eleanor's doorstep. No return address. Just her name written in unfamiliar handwriting. Inside, wrapped in a layer of newspaper, was something that made her blood run cold. A single photo of her taken just 2 days ago, standing in front of her car, loading groceries, with Marcus barely visible in the background. The photo had been taken from a distance, probably with a long lens. But it wasn't the photo that shook her the most. It was what was written on the back in faint, smudged ink. "You're not the only one who remembers what happened in 1984. And just like that, a buried year, one Eleanor had spent decades trying to forget, was dragged violently back into the present. But what happened in 1984? And who else was still watching? The answer is coming, but not yet. Because first, something else is about to surface. Something neither Eleanor nor Daniel ever saw coming. Just as Eleanor was beginning to process the chilling message tied to the year 1984, a name she had not heard in years appeared on her caller ID: Sarah. Her niece. The last time they spoke had been at her husband's funeral, and even then, it was brief and strained. Sarah had been the black sheep of the family for as long as Eleanor could remember, brilliant, but reckless, empathetic, but unpredictable. She had moved to Austin years ago to start over, but no one really knew what she'd gotten herself into. Eleanor hesitated before answering, her thumb hovering over the screen. When she finally picked up, Sarah's voice came through breathless and panicked, asking if she was safe, if she'd seen the envelope, and if anyone else had contacted her yet. Eleanor's heart clenched. "What envelope?" she asked. And that's when Sarah's story poured out like a broken dam. 2 nights earlier, Sarah had returned home from her night shift at the hospital to find a padded envelope jammed under her apartment door. No return address. No postage. Just her name, written in a hurried, almost desperate scrawl. Inside was a USB drive and a handwritten note that simply said, "Your aunt never told you everything. Plug this in and you'll understand why." Sarah had ignored it at first, assuming it was some prank, or worse, an attempt at phishing. But the next day, she came home to find her laptop screen frozen on an unfamiliar login screen, even though she'd powered it off that morning. She hadn't touched the USB drive, hadn't told a soul about it, but somehow, someone had already been inside her system. That's when she realized this wasn't just about Eleanor. It had something to do with her, too. When she finally gave in and plugged the drive into an old, offline laptop, what she found wasn't anything she expected. Dozens of scanned documents, transcripts of phone calls, even heavily redacted CIA memos all referencing an operation code-named Talarut, dated back to 1984. Names she didn't recognize. Places she'd never heard of. But one line stood out among the clutter, underlined 3 times in bold red text. Eleanor B., keyholder, subject of interest, potential leak risk. Sarah called her aunt not just out of fear, but confusion. What had Eleanor been involved in? Why was her name in classified documents? And why was someone suddenly going to such great lengths to dig it all back up? Eleanor's silence on the other end of the line was louder than any scream. She could hear her niece breathing, waiting for answers, but the words refused to form. What was she supposed to say? That long before she was a retired librarian and doting widow, she had briefly been recruited into a shadow surveillance network. That her late husband wasn't just a contractor for the federal government, but a handler tasked with maintaining a firewall between information that could destabilize national trust and the people desperate to expose it. She'd buried those memories behind layers of ordinary life, convinced no one would ever uncover the truth. But now it seemed someone was digging with purpose, and they weren't just targeting her. Worse still, Daniel wasn't picking up his phone. She called 3 times, then texted, then tried his motel's front desk. No answer. The unease that had been gnawing at her stomach now felt like a tightening rope. What if Daniel wasn't who he claimed to be anymore? What if his sudden reappearance wasn't coincidence, but orchestration? The fact that Sarah, a nurse with no political ties and no real relationship with Eleanor, had been looped into this web only deepened the paranoia. Someone was widening the net. And if that wasn't bad enough, another twist surfaced the next day when a man showed up at Eleanor's door. Older, clean-cut, with a Department of Homeland Security badge and a calm, rehearsed tone. He introduced himself as Agent Keller and claimed he was following up on a potential data leak connected to an inactive personnel file from the mid-'80s. He asked vague questions about her husband's past employment, mentioned archived infrastructure, and whether Eleanor had ever handled sensitive or transitional documentation. But it wasn't the questions that unnerved her. It was the way he avoided eye contact when she asked him to clarify his office's name. She offered to contact her attorney before answering anything else, and the man smiled, nodded, and simply handed her a card before turning to leave. But once the door was shut, Eleanor flipped the card over and found something odd. No phone number, no email, just a stamped emblem and one word: observer. That night, while trying to piece the timeline together, Eleanor stumbled across an old audio tape she'd saved in a box of personal effects. It was a recording of a phone call between her husband and a man identified only as R. She'd kept it for sentimental reasons, thinking it was about a job offer he once considered. But when she played it again now, the true context finally clicked.
They weren't talking about a job.
They were discussing containment. A woman who had accidentally intercepted a top-level transmission, who had seen too much and was threatening exposure. A woman they referred to as the librarian. And it wasn't until halfway through the tape that Eleanor realized they were talking about her. The weight of the revelation crushed her. Her husband had known. He had monitored her, protected her, perhaps, but also deceived her. And R, whoever he was, had been orchestrating moves around her without her knowledge. If this was connected to Talleyrand, then the whole story was much darker than she ever imagined. Worse yet, the files Sarah had found mentioned a secondary key, one that could decrypt the backup files and expose the entire web. If Eleanor's flash drive was the first key, who had the second? And then, as if the ground beneath her hadn't already begun to crumble, she received a text from an unknown number. It contained only a single image, a grainy surveillance still of Sarah standing in her hospital's parking garage, looking over her shoulder, unaware someone was photographing her. Beneath it was a message that sent ice through Eleanor's veins. Next time, we won't just watch. Now Eleanor faced the terrifying truth. This wasn't just about a stolen wallet, or a man named Marcus, or some dusty classified documents. It was about an entire system waking back up, one that had long decided who got to know what, and who was expendable in the name of secrecy. Her niece was in danger. Her friend might have betrayed her. Her former protector could be compromised. And the worst part? She still didn't know who was really pulling the strings. And that second key? It just might be closer than she ever dared to believe. The morning began with a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Eleanor sat at her kitchen table, untouched coffee growing cold beside her trembling hands. Sleep hadn't come the night before. Every creak in the house sounded like a footstep. Every passing car sent her rushing to the window. She'd drawn every curtain, locked every door, and placed her late husband's old revolver beside her nightstand, something she hadn't done in over 3 decades. But none of it helped, because the fear wasn't just physical, it was mental, emotional, suffocating. She no longer trusted her home, her memories, or the people she once considered safe. What terrified her most wasn't the possibility of someone breaking in. It was the realization that they didn't need to. They were already inside her life. And now, the threat wasn't just whispered from the past. It was standing at her front door, and she had no idea what it wanted, or how far it was willing to go. Just before noon, she made the decision to drive out to Sarah's place in Austin, to face this thing together. But as she approached her car, a manila envelope was taped to her driver's side mirror. Her name, again, scribbled in that same frantic hand. This time, there was no USB, no documents, just photographs.
Dozens of them.
All taken in the last 48 hours. Shots of her inside the grocery store, outside the bank, standing at the cemetery beside her husband's grave. Even more disturbing were the ones of Sarah, captured from different angles, clearly taken by multiple people, possibly even at the same time. The message was unmistakable. We're watching you. We're closer than you think. And that's when she realized something else. There were no photos of Daniel. None from the day he supposedly chased the wallet thief. None from the motel. It was as if he'd vanished completely, or worse, had never been there to begin with. Her hands shaking, Eleanor fumbled to call the motel again, demanding to speak with the clerk she'd seen before. But the man on the other end of the line claimed there was no Daniel checked in. No guest by that name. No record of anyone matching his description. She begged them to check the security cameras, but he informed her the system had been down for the past 3 days due to a server issue. Eleanor hung up, her breath catching in her throat. The man she thought she could trust, who had played the role of old friend, concerned protector, was a ghost. Either he had deceived her entirely, or someone had gone to great lengths to erase every trace of him. That night, something finally snapped in her. Eleanor began tearing through old boxes, flipping through journals, pulling out letters and tapes and forgotten notebooks from a time she had buried. The more she read, the more fragmented her mind became. There were references to Project Echo, scribbled in the margins of letters her husband had written but never sent. Pages of an unfinished manuscript titled The Librarian's Code, stuffed between tax returns and recipe cards. She remembered writing that once, just for herself, as a way to fictionalize the chaos she'd lived through in her youth. But now, reading it back, it felt less like fiction and more like a warning she'd left for her future self. A warning she hadn't been ready to hear until now. As the clock struck 3 in the morning, Eleanor's phone buzzed again. This time it was a video. Shaky, night vision footage of someone entering Sarah's apartment. A gloved hand pulling open drawers, flipping cushions, turning over photographs. Then, a final shot. Sarah's bedroom door slowly creaking open before the screen cut to black. Eleanor screamed. She dialed Sarah's number over and over, but it went straight to voicemail. In a frenzy, she called the police, begging them to send someone to check the apartment. They agreed to dispatch a unit, but the tone in the officer's voice didn't inspire confidence. "Ma'am, are you sure your niece didn't just leave town? Maybe she got scared and took off," he said. Eleanor wanted to scream. They didn't understand. Sarah wouldn't just leave. Not without saying something. Not after what she'd found. The next day, the police reported back with a short, cold update. The apartment was empty. No signs of forced entry. No broken locks. Just one thing out of place, a red envelope, sitting in the middle of the bed, addressed to Eleanor. But when they opened it, it was blank. No note. No clue. Just red paper, as if the color alone was meant to send a message. Eleanor knew what it meant. Red was the color of exposure, of danger, of silence. By now, Eleanor's paranoia had metastasized into something darker. She began noticing people outside her home more often. Unmarked vans that would park for hours across the street, only to vanish the moment she looked twice. The same man jogging by her house every morning at the same time, wearing different clothes but always the same watch. Even the mail carrier changed. And it wasn't just visual, it was emotional. Her body felt different. Her thoughts didn't feel like her own. She began to wonder if she was being drugged or manipulated. Sometimes she'd forget why she walked into a room. Other times, she'd wake up with the taste of metal in her mouth and no memory of how she got to bed. The spiral was accelerating, and she knew that whoever was behind this wasn't just watching. They were dismantling her from the inside out, making her question reality, making her question herself. And maybe that was the plan all along, to isolate her, destabilize her, make her forget the truth she was never supposed to remember. The only problem was, she had remembered. And someone out there was very, very afraid of what she might do with that knowledge. But what scared Eleanor most now wasn't what she remembered. It was what she didn't. Because deep in the fog of her past, in the shadows of those forgotten years, was something else. Something she had buried even deeper than the rest. And whatever it was, it had just started to surface. Just when Eleanor thought she had reached the peak of her confusion, when the fear and the paranoia had nearly consumed her, she received a letter that rewrote everything she believed about the nightmare unraveling around her. It came by regular mail, not hand-delivered or hidden on her car like the others. No dramatic packaging or ominous scrawl, just a simple, unmarked white envelope, nestled innocently among bills and junk mail. Her name was typed neatly on the front, in a font so sterile it sent a shiver through her before she even opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, printed with a short message that made her sit down before her knees gave out. It was never about the wallet. Stop looking there. You've forgotten what you stole first. At the bottom, a name she hadn't seen in 40 years, and Whitmore. Eleanor dropped the letter like it burned. And Whitmore had been her best friend in college, a brilliant mind wrapped in chaos, always scribbling theories on napkins and chalkboards, always chasing some invisible thread of truth. They had been inseparable until they weren't, and had vanished in 1982, shortly after an ugly falling out Eleanor could barely remember the details of. Something about a missing journal, accusations of betrayal, whispers of classified work. The police had filed it as a voluntary disappearance. No foul play. But Eleanor had always suspected otherwise. She just never had the nerve to dig deeper. And now, decades later, her name appeared like a ghost on a fresh piece of paper, as if the past hadn't moved an inch. Shaken to her core, Eleanor rushed to the attic and began tearing through old storage bins she hadn't touched in years. Amid yellowed photos, cracked cassette tapes, and fading diplomas, she found a box that didn't belong, one she had no memory of packing. Inside was a small leather-bound book, its edges brittle with age, its pages covered in cryptic notes, diagrams, and rants that started out brilliant and gradually spiraled into madness. Her hands trembled as she flipped through it. This was Anne's handwriting. These were Anne's thoughts. And halfway through the journal, Eleanor found her own name. Underlined, circled, then scratched out violently. Page after page accused her of stealing the formula, of leaking it to the program, of trading secrets in exchange for protection. But what hit hardest wasn't the accusations. It was the realization that she recognized some of what was written, not from memory, but from dreams. Eleanor had been having recurring nightmares over the past few months, filled with strange symbols, blinking machines, and voices speaking backwards. She had chalked it up to stress, maybe early signs of dementia. But now it all felt terrifyingly real, and hadn't just vanished. She had been silenced. And Eleanor hadn't just been her friend. She had been involved. Somehow, she had played a role in whatever broke and whatever sent her underground, and whatever kept her name buried all these years. But why couldn't she remember? That night, unable to sleep, Eleanor revisited the video footage she still had from the mysterious USBs and phone messages. She slowed the playback, adjusted the contrast, and noticed something she had missed before. In one frame, just before the motel camera cuts out, there's a reflection in the hallway mirror. A man in a lab coat. Not Daniel. Not the thief. A stranger. And beside him, a woman with white hair, standing behind a glass wall, scribbling frantically on the inside of the glass, as if trying to send a message. Eleanor froze the frame and zoomed in. It wasn't Sarah. It wasn't her.
It was Anne. Alive.
Older. Imprisoned somewhere. She was still out there. And suddenly, everything shifted. The theft of the wallet wasn't a random crime. It was staged. The USBs weren't warnings. They were breadcrumbs. The photos, the surveillance, the red envelopes, it was all a test. A trigger. Someone had spent years orchestrating this entire sequence of events to force Eleanor to remember what she helped bury.
And Daniel?
He wasn't just a helpful stranger.
He was part of it.
Maybe even assigned to watch her. Or worse, to contain her. All the trust, the comfort, the shared history, fabricated. She had been the mystery all along. And now that the truth was clawing its way back to the surface, someone was trying very hard to stop it. Because Eleanor had once been part of something much bigger, something buried beneath national headlines and government databases. Something and had tried to expose. Something the rest of them had sworn never to speak of again. But now someone had broken that oath. And someone else was willing to kill to keep it sealed. The air in Eleanor's home had turned dense, suffocating, as if the walls themselves were closing in on her. Every shadow now carried weight. Every silence echoed louder than noise. Her world, once filled with predictable routines and warm memories, had unraveled into something unrecognizable, something cold and watching. After the discovery of Anne's journal and that blurred image from the motel video, Eleanor knew she couldn't run anymore. She had to confront the one person who had been with her through all of this, the only person who could confirm whether she was truly spiraling into madness, or if everything she feared was devastatingly real. She had to face Sarah. But when she arrived at Sarah's apartment, what she found shattered what little trust she had left. The apartment was no longer empty. The front door, which had been tightly sealed just days before, hung slightly ajar. The chain had been broken, the lock twisted. Inside, the lights were off, but the faint glow of a laptop screen illuminated the room. On the couch sat Sarah, alive, unharmed, but not surprised to see her. She didn't cry out, didn't run to embrace Eleanor. Instead, she looked up slowly, eyes unreadable, as if she'd been expecting this moment all along. "You weren't supposed to find the journal," she said quietly. "Not yet." And with those words, the air thickened with betrayal. Eleanor felt her legs weaken as she stepped into the room, her voice barely a whisper. "How long have you known?" Sarah said nothing at first, then turned the laptop toward her. On the screen was a file labeled Op Echo, Red Revision. It was heavily encrypted, but the preview window showed a grainy image of Eleanor herself, much younger, sitting at a long metal table, being interviewed under fluorescent lights. A voice off-camera asked her questions she couldn't hear. Then her younger self looked directly into the lens and said, "No one can know what we did. Not ever." It was undeniable. The woman on screen was her. And yet, she had no memory of it. Sarah finally spoke, her voice heavy with conflicted emotion. "I didn't want to believe it at first. I thought maybe they had brainwashed you. Maybe you really didn't remember. But then you started poking around again. You triggered the surveillance. They knew you were waking up, and they sent Daniel to stop it from going any further." Eleanor's stomach twisted. "You knew Daniel?" Sarah nodded. "He's not who you thought he was. He was assigned to monitor you. I only found out because I hacked into a private database a few weeks ago. That's when I realized they were still active and that you were somehow at the center of all of it." The betrayal hit like a punch to the gut. Her own niece had been keeping secrets, watching her unravel, and hadn't said a word. But then Sarah did something unexpected. She offered Eleanor a choice. "They made contact with me. Said if I turned over the journal and stopped helping you, they'd let us walk away. Clean slates. No more surveillance. No more danger. We could disappear. But if we keep digging, if we try to expose this, they will come for us. And next time, they won't just scare us." The ultimatum hung in the air like smoke. Eleanor stood frozen, caught between two impossible roads. On one hand, she could walk away from the mystery, bury it all again, and live whatever years she had left in relative peace. But it would come at the cost of truth, at the cost of Anne, who might still be alive and waiting. On the other hand, she could push forward, shine a light on the darkness that had destroyed so many lives, and risk her own life in the process. The woman she once was, the woman in that video, she had made a choice decades ago to stay silent. But now, in the face of everything she'd uncovered, Eleanor realized she had one more decision left to make. She looked Sarah in the eyes, searching for any trace of the little girl she used to read bedtime stories to. "If you give them that journal," Eleanor said slowly, "they'll come for both of us anyway. We'll just be loose ends." Sarah blinked, but didn't deny it. "Then what do we do?" she asked. Eleanor's answer didn't come immediately. Her mind was still torn, fractured by years of half-memories and manipulated truths. But something inside her had shifted. A quiet fire. A resolve she hadn't felt in years. Maybe this was what they had been trying to suppress all along. Not the truth, but her will to chase it. But before she could say another word, the laptop screen blinked, the image distorted, and a voice crackled through the speakers. Not pre-recorded.
Live.
"Eleanor,
Sarah.
you've gone too far. This is your final warning. Turn over the journal. Or next time, we won't be so subtle." And then the screen went black. Whatever choice she thought she had was slipping through her fingers fast. The illusion of safety shattered completely the moment Eleanor and Sarah realized the voice from the laptop wasn't a bluff. Within 36 hours of receiving that warning, Eleanor's bank accounts were frozen. Her phone stopped working entirely, no calls, no messages, just a looping, no-service screen regardless of where she went. Sarah's apartment, once their temporary sanctuary, was broken into while they were away. Nothing stolen, nothing damaged. Just everything shifted slightly out of place, the most intimate kind of invasion, a calculated message. "We see you. We can reach you." It was no longer just a matter of staying ahead. It was survival. They had crossed a line, and now the system they were unraveling was preparing to erase them. Permanently. They couldn't stay put. The story had outgrown the city, outgrown their past. It had taken on a shape far more sinister than Eleanor had ever imagined. They headed to an old contact of Eleanor's, Gerald King, a former investigative reporter who had dropped off the map in the early 2000s after a story he was working on went dark. She found him living off-grid in a remote cabin near the Oregon border, surrounded by analog radios, paper files, and equipment decades out of date, but untouched by modern surveillance. At first, Gerald wouldn't speak. He looked at Eleanor like a ghost had walked through his front door. But when she slid Anne's journal across his table, opened to the page with Eleanor's name underlined, something in him cracked. He went pale and quietly said, "I knew this would come back around." Gerald began piecing it together. Operation Echo wasn't just a secret program. It was part of a nationwide initiative started during the Cold War to develop psychological warfare tools, using civilian participants, without their consent. Eleanor had been one of them. Not a conspirator, but a victim. She had been selected for her unique neurological responses, subjected to deep conditioning, memory rewriting, even experimental behavior mapping. But it wasn't just her. Thousands of civilians had been targeted, people who were later institutionalized, discredited, or conveniently disappeared. The goal was to test the limits of control, how much a mind could be shaped, erased, rewritten, and repurposed. And Whitmore had discovered part of it and tried to blow the whistle. Eleanor, unknowingly, had been part of the very mechanism that silenced her. As Gerald dug through his archives, he unearthed photographs, diagrams, names, all linked by the same obscure symbol, and had scribbled in her journal, a geometric spiral with 7 radiating points. That symbol, he explained, wasn't just an icon. It was a marker used by the shadow network within the intelligence community, one that identified sleepers and handlers. When he pulled out a manila folder labeled simply S. Ward, Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Inside were surveillance photos of Sarah, dating back 5 years, a phone tap transcript, a classified intake form with a designation Eleanor had never seen before, Phase 3 candidate, active status. Sarah wasn't just aware of the conspiracy. She had been trained by it. Eleanor stared at her niece across the room, heart pounding like thunder in her chest. "You knew," she said, her voice cracking. "You were part of this the whole time." Sarah didn't deny it. She didn't even look shocked. But the pain in her eyes was real. "I didn't choose it," she said. "They recruited me after college, said it was just behavioral research, something classified but harmless. I didn't know it had anything to do with you until the surveillance logs came through. I didn't know what you were back then, what they did to you. Eleanor felt the room spin. And you still watched me suffer. You still let them get that close. Sarah stepped forward, tears welling up. I was trying to protect you. They wanted to erase you, permanently. The only reason you're still standing is because I gave them just enough to keep them patient. But it didn't matter. The trust was broken beyond repair. Gerald stepped in, now clearly terrified by how deep the rot ran. This is bigger than any of us imagined, he said. They've buried the evidence in plain sight, university research, grant-funded programs, private sector think tanks. You were never just a pawn, Eleanor. You were the blueprint. Everything starts with you. The weight of that realization nearly crushed her. She wasn't just a victim. She had been the prototype for a psychological weapon. A living map of how to break a mind and rebuild it with new commands, new loyalties, new truths. Suddenly, the spiral symbol made sense. It wasn't just design. It was process. As they packed to leave Gerald's cabin, a signal cut through the old radio static. 3 short bursts, then silence. Gerald's face went pale. They've found us, he whispered. That's their tracer code. We've got 15 minutes, maybe less. No more time to weigh who to trust. No more time to process the betrayal. They had to run. Again. But this time, Eleanor wasn't running from the truth. She was running toward it, with fire in her chest and enemies on all sides. The conspiracy wasn't lurking in the shadows anymore. It was crashing through the front door. They drove through the night with only backroads and instinct guiding them. Gerald had given Eleanor and Sarah a new route, one that cut through forested national land and avoided every major surveillance zone marked in his old maps. The rain was relentless, the kind of cold Pacific storm that swallowed everything in fog and fury, but it also gave them cover. Eleanor could barely think through the hum of adrenaline pounding in her skull. She didn't trust Sarah, not fully, not anymore, but for now, she had no choice. They were running out of time, and answers were slipping through their fingers like water. Gerald had decoded the last page of Anne's journal, and it led to a location neither of them could believe. A remote military installation, decommissioned on paper, but still alive underground, Project Echo's origin point. They arrived just before dawn. The facility sat hidden behind rusted gates and pine-covered fencing, a brutalist concrete shell draped in decades of silence. But beneath the surface, lights still burned. They bypassed the gate on foot, armed with nothing but a burner drive filled with evidence, a few encrypted files, and a map scrawled in Anne's faded handwriting. It wasn't hard to find the entrance, a rusted hatch buried in a clearing behind the building, half covered by moss. Eleanor's fingers trembled as she turned the wheel and opened it. The air that spilled out was stale and electric, like breathing in the past. The corridors below were lit by emergency fluorescents, casting everything in ghostly green. Eleanor could feel it in her bones. This place was alive. Not with people, but with memories. Everything came back in flashes. The metal table, the electrodes, the faceless voices behind mirrored glass. She had been here before, not just as a subject, but as something more. Sarah trailed behind, her eyes wide, her body tense. "Are you sure about this?" she whispered. Eleanor didn't answer. She had to know the truth, even if it burned everything to the ground. At the heart of the facility, they found it, a command room, untouched since the 90s, walls lined with analog terminals, reel-to-reel tapes still spinning slowly, as if waiting for her. In the center of the room was a chair, bolted to the floor, with restraints hanging loose at its sides. Eleanor stepped forward, drawn to it like gravity itself pulled her in. And then the screens around the room flickered on. One by one, they activated, displaying grainy surveillance footage, psychological evaluations, and transcripts labeled with her name, followed by Anne's, Gerald's, and dozens of others. Then came the final feed. Live footage of them standing in that very room. They were being watched. Not from a satellite, not from an old camera feed live. And a voice came over the loudspeaker, one Eleanor hadn't heard in decades, but instantly recognized. "Welcome back, Subject Delta. We were wondering when you'd come home." The door behind them slammed shut. Sarah lunged toward the console, trying to override the lockout, but it was no use. The system had them. And then he walked in. A man in his 60s, wearing a government-issued windbreaker, eyes cold as granite. Dr. Victor Malin, project lead, missing from public records since 1997. He hadn't aged well, but Eleanor would never forget the face of the man who first wiped her memory. "I told them you were the key," he said calmly, circling the room. "They didn't believe me. Said Delta was too broken. But here you are, still fighting." Sarah lunged at him, but 2 guards stepped from the shadows and held her back. "She's not your puppet anymore," she snarled. Malin smiled, ignoring her. "She never was a puppet. She was the prototype. You have no idea what we built inside her." He turned to Eleanor, voice softening. "You're the last copy, Eleanor. The final version of a consciousness fracture test that worked. You don't remember what you did because we took it. We stored it. We tested it. And now it's time to put it back." The room dimmed, and a machine in the corner roared to life. It wasn't meant for restraint, it was a memory reintegration rig. All of the data they'd stripped from her, all the layers of her identity, the erased trauma, the suppressed truths, it was all here. Malin gestured to the chair. "Sit down, and I'll give it back. The entire truth. And the experiments, the real reason they shut us down. But if you don't, this all gets buried. You die not knowing who you are." Eleanor stood still. The choice paralyzed her. The truth had cost her everything already. But then Sarah, still held back by the guards, screamed, "Don't trust him. That machine, once you sit, you won't come out the same." That's what they did to Anne. They gave her the truth, and it broke her. That's when it hit Eleanor like a freight train. Anne didn't run because she was scared. She ran because she remembered everything, and they hunted her down for it. That meant if Eleanor sat in that chair, she'd finally know, but she might not come out alive. She looked Malin dead in the eye.
"No," she said.
"You don't get to choose how this ends." Then she pulled out the burner drive and threw it onto the console, just as Sarah kicked loose and slammed the emergency override on the wall. Sparks flew. The lights shorted. And then, darkness. In the chaos, Eleanor grabbed the drive, Sarah kicked open the side panel, and the 2 of them slipped into the maintenance shaft beneath the rig. Gunshots rang behind them.
Shouting.
Sirens. But somehow, they made it back out into the dawn. Their car was gone, but Gerald had left a second one nearby, a backup escape route. They didn't speak. They just drove. And as they reached the edge of the tree line, Eleanor looked down at the burner drive in her hand. Inside was a video. Unmarked. Corrupted. But playable. She tapped play. And what she saw next was herself. In a room with Anne. And she was the one giving orders. The real question wasn't what they'd done to her. It was what she had done to everyone else. The drive played all night. Frame by frame, Eleanor watched the truth unravel in a dim motel room miles from anywhere she once called home. There was no music, no theatrics, just raw footage, grainy and damning, captured from behind mirrored glass. In it, Eleanor was not the victim. She was the architect. She'd been a lead operative embedded deep within Project Echo, not as a lab rat, but as a handler, one of the few tasked with directing the psychological conditioning experiments that would later spiral out of control. And had once been her closest friend, a colleague who trusted her enough to share concerns about the project's ethics. Eleanor had dismissed her then, buried the warnings, and signed off on protocols that stripped people like and of their memories and humanity. That wasn't the part that broke her. It was the final recording. Her voice, cold and calculated, ordering Anne's detainment after discovering that she'd tried to leak internal data to the press. It was Eleanor who had initiated the command that led to Anne's disappearance. Not Malin. Not some faceless agency. Her. For hours, Eleanor sat in silence, barely breathing, the weight of what she saw pressing down like an ocean over her chest. The truth was a paradox. It gave her clarity, but it destroyed the version of herself she thought she knew. Sarah returned just before sunrise with supplies and a look of disbelief that softened into quiet understanding when she saw the laptop still glowing on the bed. "You saw it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor nodded, unable to meet her eyes. "I did everything I accused them of. I let it happen. I was a part of it." Sarah sat down beside her and didn't say anything for a long while. Finally, she said, "You were someone else then. Literally. You weren't the same person. They fractured you. You're trying to put those pieces back together now." But Eleanor wasn't sure she wanted to. Redemption seemed like a word reserved for heroes, and she wasn't one. Not after what she'd seen. Still, Sarah was right. The truth was out now, and with the contents of that burner drive, they had the power to take down what remained of Project Echo once and for all. Over the following weeks, Gerald connected them with a whistleblower organization that specialized in covert government disclosures. Using encrypted networks and anonymous sources, they began leaking parts of the data to journalists and watchdog groups. Slowly, names started to appear on the evening news. Faces from Eleanor's past. Malin, others in the chain of command, even members of private defense firms who had funded the project under the table. The public wanted answers, and this time, there were no black site contracts or national security excuses to hide behind. But with visibility came danger. 2 days after the third leak, Gerald's car exploded outside a gas station. He wasn't inside, thankfully, but the message was clear. They might have dismantled the core of Project Echo, but its shadows were still alive. Eleanor and Sarah disappeared again, this time with fake identities and burner phones, constantly changing locations and never staying in one place long enough to be found. It wasn't the life Eleanor had imagined for herself, but it was the one she'd earned. She chose to carry the weight now. Not because she wanted forgiveness, but because the people who couldn't speak for themselves deserved justice. Real justice. Then, months later, Eleanor found herself standing on a coastal cliff in Northern California, looking out at the Pacific as wind whipped through her coat. It was the same spot from the last video Anne had recorded just days before she vanished. In the video, Anne had said something Eleanor hadn't fully understood at the time. "The truth isn't a weapon," she'd said. "It's a mirror. Most people can't bear to look at what it shows them. But if you can face it, you get to live differently. Not easier, but freer." Eleanor stood there for a long while, breathing in the salt air, letting the sound of the waves drown out everything else. Maybe she couldn't undo the past. Maybe there would always be a part of her story steeped in guilt and shadow. But now, she had light too, truth, choices, the chance to be something better than what they made her into. That night, she mailed a package. No return address. Inside was the final full dump of Project Echo's classified files, memory suppression trials, subject recovery rates, footage of psychological breakdowns, and the names of every last person who funded the program. It was addressed to a major national newsroom with a single note tucked between the files. For Anne.
For all of them.
Tell it right. As for Eleanor, no one heard from her again. Some say she changed her name, started over, quietly helping victims of other Black Ops programs around the country. Others believe she vanished for good, lost in the silence she'd once helped create. But the story she left behind, her story, did something rare. It made people look inward. It made them question the cost of secrets, the fragility of memory, and how even the worst truths can still be a path to something honest. And maybe that's the real legacy she left behind. Not just justice, not just exposure, but the undeniable reminder that the truth, no matter how dark, has a way of finding the light, even if it takes a lifetime or a single stolen wallet to start it all.